James walks away from Tu Diep in tears. Will the cruel truth be uncovered by her and the police? The late afternoon sun cast a soft glow over the quiet countryside, its golden light slipping through the bamboo fence that surrounded Tu Diep's modest home. CEO James stood silently at her gate, a bouquet of fresh lilies trembling in his hand. He had come to see her, to make peace after the storm of misunderstandings and danger that had surrounded them. But what he saw through the small window crushed his heart. Inside, Tu Diep was tending gently to Tung, James's closest friend. Tung sat with a bandaged arm, bruised but alive. He had saved Tu Diep from two thugs who had attacked her in the marketplace. Tu Diep, unaware of James's presence, leaned over to adjust the compress on Tung's wound. Her eyes were full of care, her touch soft. To James, the scene was undeniable. Tu Diep had fallen for someone else. His chest tightened. The lilies slipped from his hand, forgotten. He turned away, his eyes stinging with tears, unable to step in, unable to ask why. He thought of the nights they spent talking under the stars, of the future they once dreamed of rebuilding together. Now, it all seemed like a cruel illusion. Without a word, he walked away, leaving behind the one person he had sacrificed everything to protect. What James didn't know was that everything he saw was part of his own plan. Months before, James had uncovered a massive conspiracy. John, once a trusted associate, had embezzled millions by pulling investment from James's hydropower project, resulting in bankruptcy and disaster. Worse, John had ties to a shadowy narcotics network in Thailand and was seeking revenge for the loss of his family land, taken decades ago by James's father. Knowing how dangerous John was, James had faked illness and orchestrated a plan to trap him. He instructed Tung to stay close to Tu Diep, not only to protect her, but also to help bait John into revealing himself. James even planted recording devices and worked with the police in secret. But somewhere in the maze of strategy, James forgot to guard his own heart. Tu Diep, too, had suffered. She loved James deeply, yet his silence, his sudden distance, and now his cold departure had shaken her. But when she discovered a hidden recorder James had left behind, and heard the conversation between James and his lawyer, detailing everything from John's crimes to James's self-sacrifice, her tears flowed like a river. Furious and heartbroken, she brought the evidence to the police. Together, they unraveled the last of John's criminal network. The truth exploded across headlines. CEO James infiltrates syndicate to save company and lover. James, now in hiding for his safety, saw the news and realized that Tu Diep had never betrayed him. She had protected him, just as he had protected her. Their reunion came not with grand gestures, but in silence. On the same bamboo porch where he once turned away, James stood again. This time, Tu Diep opened the door before he could knock. No words were needed, only a quiet embrace. The scars of mistrust and sacrifice still ached, but they held each other, no longer separated by lies, danger, or misunderstandings. The cruel truth had been exposed, and love, once broken by shadows, had found the light again. James sat on the bamboo porch beside Tu Diep, the night air cool and fragrant with the scent of jasmine. Neither spoke at first. The silence between them was no longer awkward. It was heavy with emotion, with everything that had been lost and found again. "I thought you loved him," James finally whispered, his voice raw. "Tung, you were so gentle with him." Tu Diep turned to him, her eyes shimmering. "I was grateful to him. He saved my life. But I only ever loved you, James." James lowered his head, ashamed. "I walked away when I should have trusted you. I saw the scene and let my heart jump to conclusions. Even though it was all part of my plan, I still let my emotions destroy me." She reached for his hand. "You were fighting alone for too long. You forgot that I could fight with you." He looked up, meeting her gaze. For the first time in weeks, There was no fear in his eyes, only quiet admiration and love. "I didn't want to drag you into danger," James said. "John is ruthless. I couldn't forgive myself if something happened to you because of me." Tu Diep smiled softly. "But something did happen to me. I lost you." James clenched her hand tighter. "Not anymore." The next day, the police arrested John at the port as he attempted to flee the country. The recording James had planted in the hospital room, when John had confessed to being the mastermind behind the embezzlement and his drug operations, had sealed his fate, with additional testimony from Tung and forensic evidence from the hydropower project. The case was airtight. At a press conference days later, James stood beside the police commissioner, publicly clearing his name and announcing a bold plan to rebuild the company, not with old investors, but with the people, the farmers, engineers, and local workers who had been hurt most by the scandal. He turned to the crowd, his voice steady. "This land deserves better. We will rise again, not for profit, but for community, for those who believe in hope." Tu Diep watched him from the side of the stage, pride swelling in her chest. This was the James she knew, not just a CEO, but a man of honor. Later that evening, as the village lit lanterns for the spring festival, James led Tu Diep through the crowd to the foot of the old banyan tree. "I once promised you lilies," he said, reaching into his jacket, but instead of flowers, he pulled out a small velvet box. Tu Diep gasped. "I've lost you once," James said, kneeling, his voice trembling. "I won't risk it again. Marry me, Tu Diep. Let's build everything, a home, a life, a future, together." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she nodded, unable to speak. The crowd erupted in applause. Somewhere in the back, Tung smiled quietly, proud to see his friend finally find peace. But even as they celebrated, the wind carried whispers of others in the shadows still watching, still scheming. The battle with John may have ended, but the world of power and business was never truly safe, and James knew, to protect Tu Diep and their future, he would have to remain vigilant. Love had returned, but peace would have to be earned. Chapter: Whispers in the Wind. Spring had only just begun to bloom when James and Tu Diep returned to the city. The company headquarters, once cold and sterile, now buzzed with a new energy. Engineers, young innovators, and local farmers met daily to co-design sustainable agricultural infrastructure. The hydropower failure had taught them all one thing: development without conscience was destruction. James kept his promise. He gave leadership roles to people who had been silenced before. Tu Diep was now leading a social development division focused on education and empowerment for rural women. But peace was not meant to last. One cloudy afternoon, while reviewing documents in her new office, Tu Diep received a call. A raspy voice on the other end spoke slowly. "You may have taken down John, but you haven't seen the last of those who funded him." The line went dead. Tu Diep froze. That voice wasn't John's. It was someone else. Someone who knew the deeper truth, that John had not acted alone. That evening, she told James. His face darkened. "I was afraid of this," he said, walking to the bookshelf in his private study. He pulled out a folder labeled Project Omega, something even she hadn't seen before. Inside were confidential reports, international money transfers, shell companies linked to offshore accounts, and worst of all, a name she recognized: Min. CEO Min, the charming, refined businessman who once played guitar in the streets and who had once expressed a clear affection for Tu Diep, had connections to one of the shell companies funding John. "He played the good guy," James said, voice grim. "But I think he's trying to finish what John started, in a quieter, more legal way." Tu Diep's heart ached. Min had always been respectful, but perhaps too perfect. She remembered his visit to her village, the glint in his eye when he spoke of harmony and tradition. Was it all a mask? "We have to be sure," she said. "I want proof." James nodded. "I'll handle men. But I need you to stay safe." She shook her head. "No, we do this together." Chapter: Beneath the Smile. Days later, at a lavish corporate gala hosted by Min's company, James and Tu Diep entered arm in arm, their expressions calm but eyes alert. Min greeted them graciously, raising his glass. James, Tu Diep, a beautiful couple, and a powerful one. James smiled faintly. "Thank you, Min. Though I wonder, power in the wrong hands becomes poison." Min chuckled, unshaken. "Then let's drink to clean hands." But beneath the table, James pressed a small recorder between the cloth. Every word Min spoke that night would be captured. Every deal, every whisper ... Later that night, as the gala ended and Min walked them to the car, he leaned in close to Tu Diep. "You know, if you ever feel tired of the chaos, my door is always open. For you." James' fist clenched, but Tu Diep smiled serenely. "Thank you, but I love my chaos." Back in their apartment, they played the recording. And there it was. "Men, we'll move the funds once the new dam contract is in place. No one will suspect, especially not James. He thinks the war ended with John. He doesn't know I created the battlefield." Silence filled the room. James leaned back, eyes narrowed. So Min was the real puppet master. Tu Diep placed a hand on his. "And now we have the string." In a world where ambition and power often blur the lines between right and wrong, the story of James and Tu Diep reminds us of one profound truth. Integrity is not just a virtue, it is a shield. Love, built on trust and loyalty, can endure storms far greater than betrayal or loss. And truth, no matter how deeply buried beneath layers of lies and manipulation, will eventually find its way to the surface. James was a man of vision, but it was his conscience, not just his intelligence, that helped him rebuild after every fall. Tu Diep was not just his companion in love, but his mirror in strength and conviction. Together, they showed that justice does not always arrive with noise and force. Sometimes it comes quietly, through persistence, unity, and the courage to uncover the truth. Let their story be a reminder that even in the darkest plots, even when misunderstood or temporarily separated, those who walk with truth will always find their way back to justice, to healing, and to each other.